Good evening, everyone. My name is コウスケクジ。今日はよろしくお願いします。ジョンさん、通訳。
The English part was good evening. My name is Mr. Kuji, and everyone said pleasure to meet you. I'll take the translation part from here.
私は日本吟醸酒協会という吟醸酒を世界に広める協会の9代目の理事長をしております。
I am the current leader I'm the 9th generation leader of an organization known as the Japan Ginjo Sake Association that's focused on promoting the wonders of Ginjo within Japan and around the world.
そして岩手県の南部美人という蔵元の5代目になります。
And I am also the 5th generation president of a brewery in Iwate Prefecture making a sake called Nambu Bijin.
私たちの日本吟醸酒協会は1981年に設立されました。
The Japan Ginjo Sake Association was formed in 1981.
日本でも大変歴史の長い団体の一つになります。
It is a group that has some of the longest history in Japan.
日本では吟醸酒というお酒、そして吟醸酒という言葉は当たり前に知られています。
In Japan, the term ginjo or ginjoshu is pretty much common sense to everybody. Everyone knows that term.
ただ世界ではまだ吟醸酒という言葉は当たり前ではありません。
However, it's not that well known outside of Japan, around the rest of the world.
私たち日本吟醸酒協会はこの吟醸酒というお酒、そして吟醸酒という言葉を世界に伝えるために今日ニューヨークにやってきました。
And so we of the Ginjoshu Kyokai have come here to make that term ginjoshu and the sake itself ginjoshu much better known around the world.
今日はたくさんの吟醸酒を揃えておりますので、ぜひ皆さんたくさん試飲をして楽しんでください。
We have a whole lot of wonderful ginjoshu lined up here for you to enjoy tonight. So by all means, please do partake of it and enjoy it.
Thank you very much. 乾杯!
So good evening again. I believe this mic is on, isn't it? So again, as introduced, my name is John Gauntner. Welcome tonight. I appreciate everyone coming. On behalf of the Sake Export Association and the Ginjoshu Kyokai, we'd like to thank everybody for showing up tonight. We'd like to thank the Japan Society, too, for having us here again. The Japan Society has been running this series of sake events for many, many years. The first one is 1999, which means this is the 25th year since they began it. Along the way, there were a couple of times when we couldn't do it, and there were a couple of other times when we actually did it more than once a year. But it's a long-running series, and we hope that it continues in the future, and we hope that you can enjoy it tonight. Tonight, we have a number of things happening, and I believe we've already had it explained to you, but just to make sure, I'll talk a few words about Ginjoshu and a bit more about the Ginjoshu Kyokai, just so everyone has a familiarity with it before you dive into it later tonight. I'll then be talking about sake, washoku, and beyond. And then after that conversation, I will sit down with Akiko Katayama, and we'll have a little panel discussion. Once that's finished, we'll introduce the brewers very briefly, and then they'll go back and prepare for everyone to come out and enjoy their sake. So with no further ado, a bit more about Ginjoshu. As Mr. Kuji explained, I think it's a very common sense word. Everybody understands that word in Japan, but maybe not so much outside of Japan. So I just want to make sure everyone knows what we're dealing with, and you go to taste that later on. So what is it? What is this Ginjo stuff? And Ginjo is basically super premium sake. And you'll notice I've got that in quotes with a question mark after it, because premium is kind of a loaded word, and I think we need to be careful with it. Another way to word it, though, is basically Ginjoshu is technically the most difficult sake to make. It calls for a lot more attention to detail, a lot of effort, better raw materials to begin with. And so it's very challenging to make. The other day, I looked at an industry publication that I read, and I calculated, and Ginjo is now 17% of all sake produced. There's a lot of factors happening in that, and it is growing a little bit every year, but it's only about 17%. So we could call that the top 17%, which would allow it, I think, to qualify for the term premium. The term itself, ginjo, a very loose translation, means brewed with carefully selected ingredients and methods. Very lot of attention to detail in the brewing methods. So that's what we're dealing with, and that's why it quite qualifies for the term premium sake. As I mentioned, it's the top 17%, the technically most difficult 17% of all sake to make. But interestingly, there's no official definition of style. In other words, it doesn't have to be sweet, it doesn't have to be dry. Much of it's very aromatic and very pristine, but there's no actually official definition of what makes ginjo what it is. But in short, it's going to be refined, it's going to be elegant, and it's going to be often quite aromatic. So when we look at the classification of ginjo or ginjo shu, the shu just means sake, and that's often dropped in conversation, both in English and in Japanese. But ginjo actually has 4 subclasses to it. Regular ginjo, junmai ginjo, dai ginjo, and junmai dai ginjo. And they're collectively known as ginjo. And that collective group is about 17% of all sake made. I think that many people in attendance today will remember that the word junmai means that the sake is brewed with rice, water, and koji only. And if that junmai word is conspicuously absent, that means they used a bit of distilled alcohol along the way during the brewing process, which is actually a very good thing. It allows them to pull out more flavor and more aroma and more complexity to the sake when they do that. So when you look at the word junmai in front of ginjo, and then when it's not there, you can note that that means whether or not the distilled alcohol step was used. So what makes it medium? What makes it premium? The main definition, legally, the main definition of what makes ginjo what it is the amount the rice has been milled before you begin to brew. That's the main legal definition, is rice milling. So in other words, to call something ginjo or junmai ginjo, you have to mill away down so that no more than 60% remains. To call it dai ginjo, which is basically ginjo to die for, you got to mill it down to a minimum of 50% or more. Those are the legal definitions. However, the implications are low temperature, long-term fermentation. In other words, premium sake like ginjo and dai ginjo is fermented for a longer period of time at lower temperatures. That stresses out the yeast and that brings out all these esters and flavorful components and fruity aromas on top of that. Another implied thing, but isn't legally specified, is that usually ginjo and dai ginjo are brewed with better rice, higher quality sake rice, and a lot more attention to detail. Every single step of the process is scrupulously monitored. Every temperature down to the 10th of a degree, checked over and over and over. So the attention to detail in the ginjo process and dai ginjo process really is what makes a difference, even though the law only states how much you have to mill the rice before you begin to brew. How long has ginjo been around? This is an interesting thing, I think. The term actually first appeared somewhere in some literature about sake in 1906. But somebody made up the term and used it in a paper, and that was about it. The first ginjo product on the market, the first product on the market in Japan that had ginjo on the label was in 1947. But nobody really did anything with it until about the late 1970s and the early 1980s, when ginjo became something that became much more visible in the market. However, and to me this is really interesting, as a legally defined grade, have legal definition and status only since 1989. So when this organization began in 1981, they wanted to promote ginjo. But what we had then was consensus among all the brewers in the industry. Just consensus. There was no legal obligation to do anything. But they said, okay, if we're going to mill it down to, if we're going to call it ginjo, mill it down to 60%. Dai ginjo, let's mill it down to 50%. But it was just mutual agreement within the industry until 1989. When the government actually said, okay, now it's legal. Now you have to do this if you want to put ginjo on the label. So sake's been around for what? 1,000 years? 1,100 years? And this ginjo product has only been around for about, 40, 45 years? To me, that's extremely interesting. Such an important part of the industry, and yet it's only been around for a very comparatively short period of time. So in the end, ginjo is great stuff. It is the pinnacle of the brewer's art. But don't feel an obligation to drink only ginjo. These days, all sake are very much worthy of our attention. So enjoy ginjo, enjoy dai ginjo, but enjoy other grades of sake as well. The Nihonshu Yushutsu Kyokai, the Japan Ginjo Association, as Mr. Kuji pointed out, it was founded in 1981 by 43 brewers that wanted to promote ginjo, which was then fairly new to the market, unlike today. Their activities include promotional events, but most importantly, outstanding public tasting events. And lately, I believe this is the second time they've come overseas with a group of brewers to promote ginjo overseas. Between like 1995 and 2015, I never missed a single Ginjoshu Kyokai tasting. They do one in the fall and one in the spring. And I would schedule my entire life around these things because basically you get 80 brewers with like 5 ginjo or dai ginjo each in a huge hotel room. And so that's a lot of sake to try and taste in two hours. It's not going to happen. But we try our best. And I got I learned so much more about sake during those tastings than any other venue that I've been in attendance. In other words, you get that much sake, I've learned so much exposure to really outstanding sake during that period of time. So enjoy as much of the sake as you reasonably can tonight, and expose yourself to as much good sake as you can. But also, if you ever get to Japan in the fall and the spring, poke around on the internet, see if they're having one of their tastings. They're still doing them. They happen mostly in Tokyo and in, I believe, Osaka. But check it out. You'll really be happy you did. You'll learn more about sake in the 2 hours that you have there, and expose yourself to a lot of great sake than any other chance you might get. So I'd like to thank the Japan Ginjo Sake Association for 20 years of great sake, but also for showing up tonight and cooperating with us to make it a great evening, and kanpai with ginjo. Moving on from that, I would like to talk about the main topic for which I'm here to speak, and it's going to be sake and food pairing, but we want to take the tack of sake, washoku, and beyond. In other words, sake and Japanese food, and beyond that. That's where I'd like to begin with. But the main three major points, start with the end in mind. Things I'd really like to convey about sake and food pairing are, number one, sake and food pairing are much like wine and food pairing. If you know how to pair wine and food, you basically know how to pair sake and food. And the next thing is that there's no reason to limit sake. There's no reason to limit sake to Japanese food at all. As we'll talk about in a few minutes, it really works very well with a wide range of Western food. And lastly, there's no rules. What I mean by that is there's no universally accepted or industry-wide principles that are agreed upon for people to pair sake. So the good news is you're pretty much on your own. That could be the bad news as well. But there's no rules you have to worry about violating or breaking when trying to learn and experiment with pairing sake and food. So if we look how sake and food pairing developed historically in Japan, Japan's got three very distinct terrains. There's a lot of mountains in there. There's plains between the mountains and the ocean, and there's a lot of oceanside breweries as well. But if you look at what people were eating 100 years ago or 200 years ago, the folks in the mountains weren't getting fresh sashimi on a daily basis. Forget about it. They were eating preserved food, very rich food, very strong food, often very salty food, sometimes sweet food, but very powerful preserved flavors. And as such, the sake that developed by brewers in the mountains tended to be rich and powerful and go well with the strong flavors of food that was eaten in the mountainsides, in the mountains. Once you get down from the mountains and the plains, all of a sudden we've got flatlands and we've got roads, which means that fresh food stuff can get around to everybody a lot more easily. And so the food that they were eating in the plains down from the mountains, but between them and the mountains and the ocean, was much fresher and lighter. And as such, the sake brewed in those regions ended up being lighter to go well with the food that was in those regions as well. And lastly, if you get near the ocean sides, in particular big fishing ports like Toyama and Miyagi and Shizuoka and many others in the western part of Japan, there's a lot more fresh fish coming in. And because of all the fresh fish, the sake that developed in those regions was even lighter and went well with the food that was in that region. So the main point is that sake develops so as to work well with and pair well with the local regional food all over Japan. How has this changed over the years? Well, the way I've worded it here is it's much more borderless and it's much more precise. And what I mean by borderless is that people all over Japan now are eating food from all over Japan. The people in the mountains are no longer limited to the food they were eating 100 years ago. They can get sashimi on a regular daily basis if they try. And not only are people in Japan eating food from all over Japan, but also a lot of Western food now has come into the country as well and is very commonly available. So the sake that people want to drink with what they have available to them today has really diversified as well. And when I talk about more precise, I think people are putting a lot more attention now to precise pairings between sake and food. In the old days, and I'll come back to this in a couple of minutes, people have one sake, a local sake, and that would just be fine with all of the food on the table. But these days, as people get more into sake and food pairing, they're much more precise with the pairings that they're trying to accomplish. So I think those are two things that have changed over the past few decades at least. The truth about sake and food pairing, one thing that's the truth about that many people might not realize, is that until recently, pairing sake and food has just not been as active a process or a practice as wine and food pairing has been around the rest of the world. For example, I think 100 years ago, you could go to a restaurant in Paris, and they would have a list of wine from which you could choose to pair with whatever dish you would choose. However, I think in sake, even today, if you went into a traditional Japanese restaurant, pretty much anywhere in Japan, that focused on one thing, for example, sushi or tempura, they'll have probably 2 sake. One if you want it warm, and one if you want it cold. And it will have been a very well selected and enjoyable sake that the proprietor is sure will go with all of the food in that restaurant. Rarely do you see a big long sake list, until recently. But I think traditionally, historically, people weren't as active in pairing various types of sake with food as they may have been in other places around the world. But again, those things are changing actually quite quickly. There is an expression in Japanese. They'll say that sake supports good Japanese food. The expression is Nihonshu Yushutsu Kyokai erabenai. And often that's translated as sake doesn't pick fights with food. I'm not sure where that translation came from, and it's not bad, but the way I would like to word it, a better translation in my mind is, because sake is so versatile and goes so well with such a wide range of food, I would say that sake doesn't care what's on the table. Whatever's on the table, sake will be happy to work with it for you. If it's sake, it doesn't really matter what the food is, and I think that's what that expression really implies. So then, what of Western food? How does Western food work well with sake? And the truth is, again, sake really is very, very versatile, goes very well with a wide range, not everything, but a wide range of Western food. And so there's no reason at all to limit sake to just sushi or other Japanese food either. It's got so much more potential. And when I say it's versatile, what I really mean is rarely does it clash so badly that you can't enjoy the sake and food together. Rarely do you have a train wreck between sake on the table and food that's on the table. However, admittedly, sake can be drowned out. Really strong flavors, like really spicy things or very powerful dishes, will certainly overwhelm a lot of sake. But for the most part, rarely are you going to get a complete mismatch that you can't work around. And again, one of the reasons is, if you look at sake, and we'll talk about this in a minute, because it developed along with washoku, along with Japanese food, and the subtle flavors that are involved with that, it doesn't really have any super powerful flavors or aromas, right? You don't got a really intense acidity, or you don't have super powerful aromas. No real strong flavors that would actually get in the way in trying to pair with a wide range of food. So that's one of the reasons why sake does work so well with non-Japanese food as well. But again, as I mentioned, there are some obvious mismatches, right? So if you want to start pairing sake and food, I think you can look at what's on the table, and you can pretty much eyeball that. You can look at something that's super spicy and say, nah, that's not going to go well with sake. Or something that's really a strong flavored meat or strong flavored sauce or something like that. So to me, if you want to sit down and start to pair sake and food, sure, there's a lot of things with which sake won't go well. There's going to be a lot of things that would drown out sake. But that's pretty much common sense. You look at that and say, nah, this'll go. And you can pretty much exclude the obvious mismatches using intuition. So I think you can do that, and then you can start to work with what potential the remaining food has. When you're talking about pairing sake and food, as I mentioned earlier, the principles of pairing sake and food are the same as the principles as pairing wine and food. As I like to say, it's not rocket science. It really isn't rocket science. In other words, you seek similarities or contrasts, right? Things that dovetail nicely together, or things that contrast nicely together to make the sake taste a little bit better, to make the food taste a little bit better, and to make the combination of them an experience that's above and beyond what either one of them were on their own. Basically, you're trying to get the sake and the food to amplify each other's assets. And again, this is the same principles as wine. And so I think that if you know how to pair wine and sake, good luck on that one. Try and pair wine and food. You'll probably do very well pairing sake and food as well. When you look at how it's done in Japan, a lot of people want to know, well, how do they do it in Japan? What's the authentic way, right? And the truth is, when you look at how people talk about pairing sake and food in Japan, there's countless theories. Every person and their sibling has a theory on how to pair sake and food in Japan. But there's really no one way. There's no one way that everybody agrees upon. What we also do not have in the sake world, unfortunately, is a real simple rule to get us halfway there. For example, red with meat and white with fish. We don't have this simple rule that gets our foot in the door. So we got to kind of start from scratch when we're working to pair sake and food. But again, there's countless theories, but there's no real one way. But it's still hard to have a total mismatch. As I mentioned earlier, there's no extremes in sake. Very rarely do you have something so screamingly intense that you can't pair it with something. There's no tannins in sake, so that's never going to be a problem. I have here no bitterness, and that's not 100% true. Once in a while, you'll get a little bit of a bitterness in sake, or a minerality perhaps. For example, if you take unpasteurized sake and you lay it down in the refrigerator for 6 months or longer, you'll get a bitterness coming out. But to me, that's something you can actively use in pairing. It can be really, really enjoyable to incorporate a slight bitterness that might come out in your pairing, but rarely, that really doesn't happen too much. So that's another thing you don't have to worry about. Excessive acidity will not be a problem either. Chemically speaking, sake's got 1/10 to 1/5 the acidity of white wine, depending on the sake and the wine, of course. Because the footprint of sake isn't that big, the acidity can be prominent in sake. That's something you can count on to do pairings, but you're never going to get this burning, searing acidity that makes it difficult to pair with anything else. It's just not going to be a problem. And again, I think the main gist of what I want to convey tonight, and I'll come back to it a couple of times here, is that sake was created to go very well with washoku, traditional Japanese cuisine. And what it does then is it enhances the raw materials. It lifts up and supports the raw materials and makes them more enjoyable. So let's bear that in mind as we move through the next few slides. And as I mentioned, they often say that sake supports Japanese food. And I used to think this was an excuse because people didn't have a better methodology. So it says, it supports the food. But over time, I realized that there was a lot more to it than that. And I think I've come to a good way to explain it. But to me, when you look at traditional washoku, what it does is it brings out and enhances the nature of the raw materials, be that fish, be that vegetables, be that meat. And so what happens then is sake kind of supports what washoku has started. Washoku will bring out the nature of the meat or the nature of the fish. Not only that, but the seasonal foods. I mean, different fish taste different in different seasons. Different vegetables are available in different seasons. So sake kind of works with seasons to enhance the food as well. But what you don't have in most washoku is really elaborate, concocted preparations. Not a whole lot of manhandling of the raw materials, right? That isn't to say that it's overly simple. I mean, a lot of the preparation of traditional Japanese cuisine is minimally invasive. However, it still calls for incredible technical skill and a lot of experience and attention to detail that's just out of this world. That's what washoku is all about. But there isn't a whole lot of manhandling or intense preparations, concocted preparations, when making Japanese food. Now, of course, there's exceptions, right? There are some Japanese dishes that do call for a lot of manhandling. And at the same time, the other side of that coin is there a lot of Western food that's actually very simple preparations as well. But for the most part, Japanese cuisine is made to enhance gentle preparations that aren't too invasive, and it brings out the nature of the raw materials, and that's where sake takes over. Sake amplifies those and supports them even further. So the way I look at this is that sake supports the enhancement of those raw materials by not overshadowing the nature of the raw materials that washoku brings out, but rather dovetailing with them to kind of support them in that way. And this is why I think sake goes so well with washoku, but also so well with a whole range of Western food as well. Another way to word this, or actually what I'd like to add to it, is it doesn't have a whole lot of strong character that stands out, right? It's kind of supporting of all the food you put on the table, but at the same time, sake still has character. It still has requisite character, enough character that will change from sake to sake to make it enjoyable, but also to make each one different enough to give it different pairing potential. And again, as I alluded to earlier, precise pairings can be done. They're much more common these days. I think a lot of younger people that work with sake, either as producers or as working in the F&B industry, they're actively trying to pair sake with one course at a time, or one little dish, and they'll pick a sake that pairs with that perfectly, as they would with wine and other beverages. I think that's becoming much more common in the industry today, and I think it's a great direction that we can continue to have high expectations for. When people want to work themselves, play with sake and food pairing themselves, I think a lot of people, and maybe a lot of professionals too, are concerned about violating authenticity, right? What's the real way to do it? What's the right way to do it? How do they do it in Japan? But as I mentioned earlier, there's really no one authentic way to do this. There's a lot of theories, but there's nothing that is universally agreed upon within the sake industry or within the F&B industry in Japan. So there are no universally accepted practices. There is no one authentic way. So the best way to learn to pair sake and food is to experiment. Learn by doing and violate away, have at it, and see what you can come up with by pairing yourself. And I think that is the best way to learn and the most enjoyable way to do it. Having said all that, I think there are a couple of things, guidelines that you really can't do with sake that I think are worthwhile to convey. And one of those is to pair based on region alone. I think perhaps with wine and with other beverages as well, you might be able to say, well, if it's from this particular region, for a handful of reasons, it would go well with this particular food. And you can't really do that with sake because there's 47 prefectures in Japan, And in my rough assessment, I would say about 60% of the prefectures have an identifiable style of sake that can go with that prefecture. Be it sweet, be it dry, be it rich, be it aromatic. And the issue is, though, of those 60% that have an identifiable style that can be associated with them, not every single brewery in that prefecture will conform to that style. You might have a totally dry prefecture, and maybe, 4 out of 10 will be a sweet sake. So my point is, if you just pair based on region alone, even if you work with the regions that have a good style associated with them, you've got only a 60% chance of being right. You got a 40% chance of missing. That's probably not high enough if you're trying to pair sake and food to the best of your ability. Another thing you can't do is pair based on the choice of rice alone. And I think you can do this too with grape varietals and perhaps other raw materials for other beverages as well. And there's about 110 rices that are used in sake production. And a lot of them have a very distinct character to them. However, 50 brewers can take the exact same rice, milled down to the exact same degree, and make 50 completely different sake, depending on the temperature at which you ferment, the yeast that you used, the way you make the koji, how many times you pasteurize, a million things will make every one of those sake completely different. So if you try and pair based just on a rice, you don't know which one of those 50 varieties it's going to end up being. So you're going to have a very not so high chance of getting a pairing that you might expect. So you really can't pair based on the choice of rice alone either. The third thing is pair based on grade. So in other words, Dai Ginjo is very aromatic, so you want to pair it with this. Or Junmaishu is very rich and acidic, thank you very much. And so you can pair based on that. And that's kind of difficult too, because there's a lot of, for example, Dai Ginjo, where most of it is aromatic, there's a lot that isn't so aromatic, especially these days. And Junmaishu is another example. Usually it's going to be fairly rich with a good acidity to it. But these days, there's a lot of light, aromatic Junmaishu as well. So the point is, the various grades are starting to get fuzzy and overlap quite a bit. So in my opinion, you don't really want to count on that entirely either. Having said all that, of these three, region, rice, and grade, probably pairing by grade, if you don't have a chance to taste the sake, holds the most potential, at least in my mind. So because of all of these things, really, if you want to pair sake and food, familiarity and experience are the key. You should know the sake from which you have to choose, and if you know the food pretty well, you'll do just fine. You can't really pair by the label, as you might be able to with other beverages, so you need to know the products that you're working with, and that's probably the best way to do it. And don't be afraid to experiment and violate any principles you might perceive to exist. Almost lastly, I do have a couple more things to say, but I want to talk about umami. I think everyone's probably pretty familiar with the term umami these days. That might have been different 20 years ago, but subtle richness, savoriness, again, I think it was formerly hard to define, but not so much anymore. And I think you can do pairings based on umami. In other words, you look at the sake from which you have to choose, and look at the relative levels of umami, and then look at the food you have. How rich is that? And if you pair based on the relative levels of umami, that's actually a very simple, enjoyable, and dependable way to do a sake and food pairing as well. I do know that some people say it's all about umami. I'm like, nah, I don't think it's all about umami. But umami is valid as well. Many traditional Japanese rice, sake nibbles, things that you enjoy with sake, are indeed very, very rich in umami. But again, there's a lot of Western food, fortunately, that has a lot of umami in it as well. A lot of cheese does, a lot of ripe vegetables do, scallops, things like that. There's a lot of things that have plenty of umami in Western food. So umami is a good linchpin with which to base a pairing decision, even when you're working with Western food. If you're interested in working with umami, there's two types of sake. One is yamahai, and the other is kimoto. And they're ways of preparing the yeast that give you a gamier, more umami-driven sake in the end. Often acidity and sweetness are higher as well. But if you wanted to mess with umami as a linchpin for pairing, look for a yamahai or a kimoto, and that will give you a lot of umami to work with. And that can be a really fun thing to work with as well. One or two more things I'd like to talk about. One is pairing sake with desserts. And this, to me, is an interesting conversation. So the principle of pairing sake and desserts is pretty much as the principle of pairing with wine and desserts. In other words, your sake should be sweeter than the dessert. Otherwise, it's going to get drowned out. It's going to get overshadowed by the dessert that you might have. But if you look at Japanese desserts, they're not that sweet, right? I mean, here in the United States, we'll have double chocolate cake with chocolate icing and chocolate chips on top of it, and just really, really very, very sweet things. But most Japanese desserts aren't so intensely sweet. Sometimes you just have fruit or lightly sweet confections, right? So sake didn't really develop in the direction of having to work with dessert. There's another reason for that. Usually in Japan, when the desserts come out, it's tea rather than sake. And by that time, historically, traditionally, sake is off the table. So for that reason, sake never really developed in the direction of having to stand up to super sweet desserts. Having said that, it can be done. Some modern sake, not that much, but some modern sake is built for desserts. In particular, there's a type of sake known as Muroka Nama Genshu. And Muroka means not charcoal filtered. So it's going to be bigger and rougher and more rambunctious. Nama means unpasteurized, which everything's going to be supercharged by that. And Genshu usually means a slightly higher alcohol. And that's just going to bolster the package as well. So you get this big, sweet, aromatic sake, and that stuff will stand up to most desserts in the West. There's another type of sake called kijoshu, which is a special way to make it, but it ends up being really sweet and rich, and that's a great dessert sake too. But there's really very little of that on the market. So you might want to remember that, but you won't find too many of them in the market here in the United States. But at the end of the day, sake is such a versatile beverage and so enjoyable that I think if you relax and enjoy with good food and good sake on the table, you can enjoy yourself. There's good food and good sake on the table together, you're bound to enjoy them. So those are the basic principles I wanted to convey about pairing sake and food, and in particular, sake's how well it goes with washoku. From now, what I'd like to do is wrap up my conversation here, and Ms. Akiko Katayama will join me, and we'll do a bit of a short conversation over here at the table. So if we can have the screen go up.
So that was a very exciting presentation. Thank you. And the sake is very flexible and forgiving, which is good news. So I think the audience burning question is personally, what's your favorite sake and food pairing that has surprised you?
How much time does everybody have? Actually, if I had to pick one, and it's a Western dish, well, the others would be as well. What I really think is an outstanding pairing is a simple pasta with a cream-based sauce, and then bacon crumbled on top of that, real bacon. And that paired with a simple traditional junmaishu, with a good viscosity and acidity out there, is just one of the most outstanding pairings I've ever had. It's really, really enjoyable. And just one more, grilled lamb with pepper or cumin with a kimoto or a yamahai is another one that's just to die for. And those are two just off the top of my head.
Right. Well, lamb can be very difficult when you have to pick wine, so I think that's a good example to choose sake to pair with lamb.
Yeah, I agree with that. It works quite well. How about yourself? What would you pair?
Hands down, sake and cheese. And I tried many pairings. And for example, French goat cheese like chèvre with junmai, with rich umami junmai, yamahai. And I like the Italian sheep's milk cheese, like a soft young cheese with, that was a junmai ginjo. And American cheddar was great with the aged sake. So
this is totally off script. But do you think that you need acidity in pairing with cheese? Or does it depend on the cheese? For example, hard cheese maybe doesn't need, I don't know.
I think the acidity is a tricky thing. Like you said, the sake's acidity is kind of milder. But I drink a lot of wine as well. My first encounter with alcohol beverage I liked was Chablis, which is cleaner and not so acidic. So that was a very gentle experience. That's why I think I got into wine as well. But yeah, I think fatty food tend to get helped with acidity, but it can be too harsh. Can be. So when it comes to like very acidic wine, cheese can be overwhelmed. So I think sake and cheese, I think is
even better than wine and cheese.
I think so.
You heard it here first, folks.
My honest comment.
So since you work so closely with wine and so long and have so much experience with it, how do you approach sake in food pairing? Either in comparison with how you approach wine, maybe different, or how do you approach it?
Right. So like you, I'm very flexible, and I always look for surprise. And I have a good example. So one day I went to a really good dinner prepared by two chefs, one from Italy, one from Japan. And so it's a multi-course dinner, and each dish by each Italian Japanese chef, paired with both Italian wine and Japanese sake. And you don't expect which one is which. And it was a really great pairings by great sommeliers. So you don't even plan to expect something like, I like the heavy umami rich bolognese, tomato sauce, and tomato sauce with sake. You don't expect so much, but that was perfect with actually Yamahai.
So it sounds like it would be.
Umami. Right. So what about bad pairings?
Oh, bad pairings. Well, in terms of pairings that don't work well, to me, really strong flavors, spicy things, like, for example, Thai food, or really, really spicy things like that. These kinds of things, real intense flavors too, like a very, very rich piece of beef that's been prepared with a lot of strong sauce on top of it. It's not that these are impossible pairings. It's just that they're distracting. You got to think so hard and work so hard and concentrate on what's really working or not working between the food and the sake that, frankly, it's not worth the effort. So to me, when you get something really intense, intensely spicy, things like that, I think those are only bad pairings only because they make you intellectually work harder than I ever want to work when I'm pairing sake and food.
Right.
For example, really spicy things, nigori is an easy shoe-in. Nigori will always cool down or calm down a really spicy dish. But that's kind of, okay, we got that. What else do we have, right? And so beyond that, it's kind of difficult with super spicy things, I think. But again, it's just the intellectual effort that I find myself having to put in that I'm not really thrilled about when it comes to super spicy things and strong things. How about yourself? What do you think doesn't work?
So I don't think I ever had a bad pairing because so before I pair any food, sake with food, I tend to have a very romantic moment by myself with the sake, and I really like reading about sake brewers' history and ingredients background, everything, and also then you really examine the texture and the flavor, taste, structure of sake, and then you have that understanding. You feel very close to sake, and you can't fail to pair with food.
That's a good philosophy too. I think that'll work well.
Right. So, so you gave us a lot of interesting dimensions in looking at sake, how to pair with food. But how about the structure and the depths of sake that you feel in your mouth, and how do they apply to sake and food pairing?
To me, it's interesting because I actually very much enjoy looking at structure and depth and resonance in sake, right? However, what was the other thing? Structure and what did you say?
Depths.
Oh, you did say depth. Okay, good. Those are good things, but to me, they're more intuitive and less concrete. So when I'm trying to ponder a pairing, I don't think about structure or depth. It's hard to imagine structure and how it's going to work with the flavors and aromas of the food, or depth, or resonance, and imagine how that's going to work with the flavors of food. So it's kind of, I would rather look at concrete flavors and aromas in the sake and see how those would work. And if the depth and the structure work, then it was an extra bonus. That's actually how I look at them. I don't myself use them because they're not really concrete enough to do pairings, in my opinion. How about yourself? Do you use those aspects of sake yourself?
Right. I tend to pay more attention to mouthfeel, probably because I grew up in Japan. And so I heard, compared to other languages, Japanese language has more words to describe food texture. And there's a study, actually, and then I was surprised. There were 400 words to describe food texture in Japanese. Wow. And somebody counted. And, and in Chinese, it's 144 or something. And when it comes to English, it's much fewer. So like crispy or crunchy, and in Japanese, it can be pari-pari, kari-kari, shari-shari. You can just come up with like 10 easily. So that's my first thing I really taste anything, mouthfeel. So what about you? What do you think about mouthfeel? Is this related to the structure?
I suppose the answer to that question is yes. I don't think mouthfeel is another thing that I would initially try to use as a pairing parameter. I actually, again, just like structure and depth, I mean, whenever I'm tasting professionally, I look at that all the time, right? How does it touch the palate? How does it feel against the tongue? How does it go down? I look at that all the time. And probably because hindsight is 20/20. Once I taste a sake and try a pairing, I'll probably look back and say, oh yeah, the mouthfeel made it work real well. But initially, I guess I tend to look at more concrete things. It's a wrong way to put it, but I lump that in together with structure and depth, I guess. Something I would initially look at, but later look back and say, yeah, that it worked because of the mouthfeel.
Another term related to structure is the minerality.
Yeah, minerality, yeah.
So, I mean, it's such a elusive word, and in the wine world, people don't understand what is it, and nobody can really describe it. But when it comes to sake, what do you think about
Well, some sake has it and some sake doesn't. And I think it's a very, very valid descriptor for sake, minerality. And very often it comes right from the water. I mean, so there's hard water and there's soft water, and hard water has a lot more mineral content, and soft water won't have so much minerality in the final sake. But if you find a sake that's made with a water source that has a lot of minerals in it, obviously, it's going to have good minerality to it. And minerality is and that's something I consider to be an overt factor. In other words, I look at minerality and say, because of this minerality, it'll go well with that. So I think it's a very, very valid flavor element. I do enjoy minerality in sake, but it's also something that you can easily use to decide on pairings.
Interesting. So, because when it comes to minerality, wine world use the term to analyze the soil type, but this Japanese sake is more about water. So I thought it was really distinctive, like Nada to Niigata to all those Kyoto.
Right. But I mean, at the end, water runs through the soil very seriously, or through the rock and goes into the wells, right? So there's a brewer I work with closely in the southwestern part of Japan that has limestone caves all around the brewery, and all the water in his wells filtered through that limestone. So there's a ton of calcium in it. That might be an extreme example, but even the water has to go through the soil and the rock and picks up the minerals in that way. But again, there's also soft water, right? There's a lot of water out there that doesn't have much mineral content.
Okay, so increasingly more breweries are making new style of sake, and like you said in the presentation, and for example, sake made with flower yeast, which has really flowery notes. So do you think they are easier to pair with non-Japanese?
Yeah, I would think so. Again, sake developed with Washoku over the centuries, and I think that the aromas that the traditional yeasts used back then, which were naturally occurring, helped augment how well sake went with Japanese food. And I think that when you bring in some of these new flower yeasts, which by the way are harvested from near flowers, and they don't make the sake taste and smell like that flower, it's because of the nectar in those particular flowers. There's a lot of the yeast cells that are found naturally occurring there can be used to brew sake. But they weren't things that naturally occurred in the sake world. They were brought in later. And they're very good yeasts, but they tend to have slightly different, earthier, very expressive mineral almost, flavor profiles and aromatic profiles. And I think it's going to be easier to pair those things with Western food, bigger, bolder Western food, than it might be with traditional Washoku, now that you mention it.
Right. Do you think of any other new styles of sake that could be helpful to expand pairings?
Yeah, to me, I mean, one direction that I think modern premium sake is going is what they call juicy sake, which means a higher sweetness and a higher acidity together, right? Probably much more than traditional sake had. They deliberately, they go out of the way to give you a higher sweetness and a higher acidity. I think a lot of brewers crank up the acidity or try and create more acidity to try and capture part of the wine market, which is fine. If people like acidity, give them acidity. But if you have a higher sweetness and a higher acidity, you get this type of sake that makes you salivate. And I think that just gets people ready for pairing that with food. And again, rather than say juicy sake or stuff with higher sweetness and higher acidity, we'll definitely go with this type of food. That's when we start to experiment, start to taste that and see, okay, what will this work with? What can I have this dovetail with? What will this support? And I think just experimentation, once you've got that stuff in your hand, is the best way to go.
Right. So tasting food with sake probably raises a question about what kind of serving vessels and what's your favorite?
So when talking about serving vessels, first, the stuff that they actually bring the sake to you in, Given the choice, there's two what I would go for. One is the sake bottle. Seriously, I mean, I like looking at the bottle in front of me and spinning it and getting the specs off of that and all kinds of stuff like that. So I'm very comfortable enjoying sake right from the bottle. If I didn't do it from the bottle, I like what's called a katakuchi, which is basically a bowl with a dimple in one end so you can pour it out of the bowl, right? And there's different sizes of these things. But what I like about that is you can get a lot of sake into a katakuchi, but then you kind of got a lot of surface area there that lets the aromas start to get a head start and come out. And I kind of think that, I don't know, it aerates the sake a little bit and brings out a bit more flavors and aromas more quickly. So I'm quite fond of katakuchi myself. And that's for pouring it or serving it. In terms of vessels, again, white wine glasses do a great job of making the most out of a sake. I love Japanese pottery, but it's a little expensive to collect a whole lot of them. And in truth, a lot of Japanese pottery shapes are maybe not optimal for maximizing the aromas and flavors of good sake. But I also like straight tumblers, just a simple tumbler. But one thing I think is important is a very thin rim, which wine glasses have anyway, right? But if you can have a pottery or something, a very thin rim, to me, helps the flavors get distributed across your palate a lot more easily. So those are the vessels I'd use. How about yourself?
So I totally agree. And what's called, if you go to Amazon, there's a universal glass. That's the term used to find the best sake serving glass myself. That universal wine glass is good for, literally, good for white wine, red wine, rosé, anything, even champagne. So, but I like the stemless, like,
Yeah, I do too.
the tumbler, because especially when I want to see the color of sake, I put the white sheet of paper underneath and then see the actual subtle yellowish or pale green, and that really indicates some taste and flavors.
Pardon me, please? The color?
The color.
The color will tell you a lot about it, yeah.
Right. How do you explain that how the color can tell you what's
Well,
the prediction?
Before we talk about that, remember a lot of sake is charcoal filtered, which will strip away that color. Because a lot of consumers in Japan like more pristine, clear stuff. But let's assume that it isn't charcoal filtered. And then the little amber color will tell you about age. It'll tell you how long the sake has been aged, but it'll also show you the amino acid content. And it's not a simple equation. In other words, the higher the amino acid content, the sooner it will take on color, right? So it could tell you how rich the sake is or tell you how old the sake might be. But I would say the more color you have, the less light it's going to be. I don't think that's proper English, but I think people know what I meant. The more color you have, the less of a lighter sake would be. The more of a richer or more mature sake would be. So I do look at color, but I always bear in mind, too, that there's a good chance it was charcoal filtered. And so the color that was originally there may not be there.
Right. What about, see, kind of like pale green or yellowish? I feel
Yeah,
very
that's cool
excited.
too. Yeah, it is, especially in
Right.
freshly pressed sake, right?
Right.
It's almost like this lime green touch. Yeah, that's beautiful, actually.
Right.
Very cool.
And it changes the texture. If it's, you can find some color.
Not the fact that it's colored itself, but what led to the color change might change the texture, right? In other words, if it's got a lot of amino acids, you're probably going to get a much heavier, richer sake, and same with the fact that if it's aged. So the color might tell you that other things have happened that are going to affect the weight and texture.
Right.
Yeah, so it's not a result of the color, but the color is also a result of the same thing that's going to give you a heavier sake.
So this is my last question. It's kind of off script, but so you've been just talking about charcoal filtered kind of sake, but I think we started to see more ancient style sake making, which I think is interesting. So do you think it's going to be less? It's like, in the wine world, natural wine is becoming huge. So do you see the same kind of trend?
Well, I think that most of the changes that have taken place in the sake production methods over the last 1,000 years have been done so for a reason, meaning they lead to better sake, as most people like to enjoy it, right? In fact, ginjo, which we're talking about tonight, they manhandle the heck out of that stuff. They mill the rice way down. They starve it for water. They grow mold upon it. And so to make it as natural as possible would be interesting. But I think Nihonshu, sake, in particular ginjoshu, has developed along the lines of being more refined and delicate and aromatic and expressive because they don't do those things, because they actually do, be a bit more invasive. So natural sake is cool. It's enjoyable. But I think the industry has developed in another direction for very good reasons. And actually, that's where my preferences lie, to be honest.
Right. Okay, so, well, you are encyclopedia of sake,
No,
literally,
just
so we
winging
could
it. Just winging it. So.
So, thank you so much.
Can we wrap up?
Yeah.
I think we barely made it up here, so. So to begin with, there's actually a few more sake out there for whom there is not, or for which there is not a representative. So almost every sake is represented by someone up here. So from Saga Prefecture, representing Shichida Sake, Mr. Hotum. From Yamaguchi Prefecture, representing Dassai Sake, is Mr. Sakurai. From Iwate Prefecture, representing Nambu Bijin Sake, is Ms. Stuyvesant. From Fukushima Prefecture, representing Okunomatsu Sake, is Mr. Yusa. From Tochigi Prefecture, representing Tentaka Sake, is Mr. Ozaki. From Shimane Prefecture, representing Rihaku Sake, is Mr. Tanaka. From Hiroshima Prefecture, representing Fukucho Sake, is Ms. Ishiguro. From Niigata Prefecture, representing Hakkaisan Sake, is Mr. Sullivan. From Fukushima Prefecture, representing Naraman Sake, is Mr. Shoji. From Tori Prefecture, representing Chiyomusubi Sake, is Mr. Okasora. From Hiroshima Prefecture, representing Maboroshi Sake, is Mr. Nakao. From Oita Prefecture, representing Yatsuka Sake, is Mr. Aso. From Akita Prefecture, representing Chokaisan Sake, is Mr. Oi. Also from Akita Prefecture, representing Tamakine, Hyakuden, and Ranman Sake, is Mr. Otomo. From Aichi Sake, representing Horai-sen, is Mr. Sekiya. From Hyogo Prefecture, representing Kototsumi Sake, is Mr. Nishiyama. Also from Hyogo Prefecture, representing Tatsuriki Sake, is Mr. Honda. And from Ibaraki Prefecture, representing Gokeiji Sake, is Mr. Aoki. From Shizuoka Prefecture, representing Takatenjin Sake, is Ms. Doi. From Shimane Prefecture, representing Iwami Ginzan Sake, is Ms. Asano. From Nagano Sake, representing Yamasan Sake, is Mr. Ogihara. And from Brooklyn, representing Brooklyn Kura, is Mr. Don. So now the brewers will head out back, prepare their tables for everyone, and in a couple minutes, we'll be able to enjoy their sake.